Right, project appraisal. So situations, scenarios, I suppose. One where um, the borrowing rate and deposit rate are the same. The other one is where the borrowing rate and the deposit rate are different. We know when we look at our credit cards and our deposit accounts from banks or lending organisations, we know the interest rate for borrowing is usually greater than the savings rate, the deposit account. So that cost of borrowing is higher. Okay. So why are we looking at this? Well, a project may require some investment. So I'll say early on, need some investment there. So in terms of the cash flow into the project, that is represented by a negative. And then the project, such as building a factory to build new cars or something, should then later on generate some positive cash flows later on. So the question then becomes, how good is a project? Not an awful word to use, correct? So done it on purpose because there's several measures here. One might be how profitable it is. One might be how long does it take to, I'm just going to put make money. That can mean a number of things as well, but you get the gist of what I'm trying to say. Also, there's other things as well. Does it support some strategic aim for an organization, say? So I'm not going to write this bit, but for that one, examples are things such as a company has built a new finance system, something like that, or a new, if it's an insurance company, say a new quotation system, and the long-term aim might be to get as many new products on that system as possible. And we look at a particular project, and it might not look massively profitable compared to other projects, but you can get it onto the quotation system, so that meets that strategic aim of the group or company or whatever. But also it might mean then it's easier to build as well. So there might be a strategic aim to only build products, policies that are don't represent a large investment of resource to do that. Okay, right. Them sort of things which I talked about there usually come up at the end of exam questions. Will be the 2 marker at the end says which project looks best, or or why, what other factors would you consider outside of envy, NPV or profitability, to decide whether the company might invest in this project, something like that. Okay, right. So we have various mathematical measures which we want to think about. So we've got this net present value. We have this internal rate of return, and then we have this discounted payback period. So net present value is, go here, it's the present value of income minus the present value of outgo. So outgo here is how much it costs to purchase land, how much money you required at the start, and then income is how much income comes from the trading of the project, something like that. Now I want to put this down, so I just thought about this, all cash flows. I'll make reference to that in a little while. So this MPV is in essence the profitability at a risk discount rate. So some terminology there. I. So remember that. So sometimes you might just see interest rate, but often with projects you see the risk discount rate. So that represents almost the required return from that project. Now here at the moment we're assuming that this borrowing and deposit rate is the same. There is just one risk discount rate at the moment. Next thing is the internal rate of return, and this is, so I just changed that because I put an equal, but that's not helpful. This is the present value of income equals the present value of outgo at the IRR, and we'll just call that J. So you can see that you equate all these cash flows, again, so all cash flows, and you see what interest rate does that at. Now, why is that helpful? There might be what's called a hurdle rate that the project has to achieve. If J turns out to be, if the internal rate of return turns out to be greater than the hurdle rate, HR, implies proceed. The hurdle rate often can be the cost of borrowing, something like that. The risk-adjusted cost of borrowing. You don't have to worry too much about that. And then finally, the discounted payback period, which will go over here, DPP. This is how long the discounted cash flows, income and outgo, take to equal 0. So this is your payback. So you can have a payback period as well, which isn't discounted. So taking into account of interest, this is when the project is break even. So this can have two ways, and you've seen it described in your notes as the accumulation to time t, where t is the DPP, equals 0. So you accumulate past cash flows to t, but also equally, I'm going to have to go on to the next slide on this one. Equally, you can have the net present value, which of course is at time 0. Okay, so net present value of cash flows up to time t equals 0. Now, Why have I made a big thing of this? Because this up to time 0 is different to these all cash flows up here. Up here, we said the net present value is the present value of the income minus the present value of the outgo. But this was all cash flows under the project, all the way along, all these things. That gives the profitability. Now what we're saying, to find the DPP, we want to find a net present value of 0, but only include the cash flows up to time t, which is t is the discounted payback period. So I ask you to have a play around with that with some examples. Got plenty of questions on Moodle now. Once you start playing around with it, you'll start to get a feel for it of what it's trying to do. Okay, right. I'm going to have to go on to another one. Right. Now we're going to come up with a scenario where, so the situation when I borrowing does not equal I deposit, and further, I borrowing is greater than I deposit. So what did we do here? So depending on whether your project is in deficit or not, will determine which interest rate you discount things out or accumulate things out. So we've said that most projects need some investment at the start. Some don't. If they don't, you can't get an internal rate of return, by the way. So just think about that relative to earlier. And typically what happens, so you have some investment at the start and then the income starts to come in and eventually they go positive. But while you're in here, you're still a net borrower. So you use the borrowing rate. Nearly got my letters muddled up there. And here, once the project's gone positive, your balance means you can use a deposit rate. So the formulas we talked about just now, the present values, etc., you have to split into two in this case. So here, where the project goes positive is the DPP. So what you need to do first of all is find the DPP. And then you'll know before, I could have just put T less than DPP, that'd have been better. Use IB, where T is greater than the DPP. Use ID. Now we're going to talk about that in a little bit more depth here. So how would we find the net present value for a project when we've got these two rates? We've got IB and ID, but they don't match each other. This situation, as I talked about, get rid of that. So the NPV. So first of all, is effectively V. I'm just going to put DPP up there just so I keep it going. And then the present value of the cash flows after that point, after DPP. There's some questions on this. Because all the cash flows before that come to zero. They're already at zero. So these are the only ones what contribute to the profitability. So here, this is the period we're going from the DPP back to 0. So that V is at IB, and this one is at ID, because that's after that point in time. So you need to play around with that because there's a fair amount of thinking. I can go through this here, but I haven't got examples in front of me right now. They're on Moodle, mind you. And that brings it to life. Now, that's one way to think about how you can do the profitability. The other way, so I'm just going to say that's way one, so which is split cash flows, I'm going to say by DPP. You know what that means. Now, the other method is mechanical. Now, we've done this for one of the assessments. Hopefully, I'll spell it right. Oh, I think it's assessment 2. Yeah, assessment 2, where we go through each time period and we say we look at what's the balance, like the bank balance at the start. What cash flow is there? Is that a positive or a negative? Add or minus that. Then we say plus or minus again. We say how much interest is payable. Now that's where we get to the borrow rate or the deposit rate, and that gives us the balance at the end. So we go through, and that will eventually give us the accumulated profit. And then obviously we can discount that back to 0 if we so wish. So this second method is mechanical sort of thing. You often do when you're in a finance team. And then this first method is, if you've got specific financial maths training, you can use this. But both should be equivalent. Right. I'm not sure if I wanted to talk about too much more. As I said, usually, so that's all the sort of mathematics I want to talk about. Usually there's, here's a project or here's 2 projects. Which one's better? And finally, you sort of get that wordy bit at the end, what says, something like, well, you don't just take account of the profit. You take account of the term, how long the thing is, other factors. Who you've borrowed the money off, do they want it back earlier, all things like that. So they're common sense things, really. As long as you understand the mechanics, you should be able to, easily eke out a couple of marks. And that'll only be a 1 or 2 mark question anyway. I've never seen it much more than that. Otherwise, we'll be into the world of written exams, which, wordy exams, which we're not. So yeah, you'll see 1 or 2 marks. You should easily be able to eke them out. They're not complicated things. Don't require too much revision. Just sort of a slight bit of lateral thinking usually at the end. And I think that's it. So that's a big section, but actually when you break it down, there's 3 metrics to think about. The NPV, the internal rate of return, and the DPP. And then there's just 2 situations. One where there's just a risk discount rate, one interest rate across everything, which is always nice. And then the second situation is where you get these different interest rates depending on where the balance of the project is, whether it's negative or positive, which is then, and then of course the step is to determine the DPP and separate accordingly, or mechanically go through each calculation and really the only thing there to work out is which interest rate you need to apply. And then finally, just a few words, so some sensibly written sentences, not a great load of prose, not paragraphs. So I think for 6591, that is about it. So I shall speak to you all again soon.